So picture this, a country that literally rises from the ashes of the world's most brutal war to become a global superpower. An incredible story, right? But what if, at the exact same time, its own countryside was starving? Well, that was the Soviet Union after 1945. It's this wild paradox, a story of unbelievable success right alongside just devastating failure. And that's the tale of two recoveries we're going to unpack. And this number, this is where it all begins. 27 million. That is the mind-boggling human cost of what they called the Great Patriotic War. To put that in perspective, that's about 1 out of every 8 citizens gone. So this wasn't just about rebuilding buildings, it was about trying to survive a demographic catastrophe. In the physical damage, it was just as bad. We're talking about thousands of towns, tens of thousands of villages, just wiped off the map. Their core industries, steel and mining, were producing at half their pre-war levels. And then, right when they needed help the most, that crucial American aid, it got shut off. This was the bleak, rubble-filled world Stalin was looking at in 1945. So how do you even begin to respond to that level of devastation? Well, the Soviets answered with an industrial comeback that honestly was nothing short of miraculous. They basically turned back to the playbook from the 1930s. Brutal, centralized control focused on one thing and one thing only: rebuilding state power first. Their main weapon was the Fourth Five-Year Plan. And just look at that number. 85% of all investment went straight into heavy industry. Let's be clear, this was never about building new homes or making life comfortable for everyday people. It was about raw power: coal, steel, and electricity.
So how on earth did they pull it off? Through absolutely relentless and, frankly, brutal methods. The entire society was mobilized. You had millions of German prisoners of war and inmates from the Gulag forced labor camps put to work. They literally dismantled entire factories in Germany and shipped them back east as war reparations. And on top of all that, regular citizens had to do hours of so-called volunteer work every month.
And the results, at least on paper, were just astonishing. Now, you always have to be a bit careful with official Soviet statistics, but the trend here is undeniable. Just look at steel. It crashes during the war, but by 1950, it surged to over 27 million tons, way more than before the war. Coal and electricity tell the exact same story of this supercharged, massive recovery. And this wasn't just about numbers. It produced these powerful, symbolic victories. The famous Dnieper Dam, a jewel of their pre-war efforts that was blown up in the fighting, was back up and running by 1947. Then, in 1949, the whole world was shocked when the USSR tested its own atomic bomb, becoming a superpower years before anyone thought possible. You just can't argue with it. Industrially, the recovery was a huge success. But here's the thing about this era, that triumphant, official story. It was hiding a much, much darker reality. The incredible success of the factories was being paid for by a profound failure somewhere else. So you have to ask, what was being sacrificed for this industrial miracle? Okay, so now we're going to turn away from the roar of those factories and listen to the silence of the fields. We're moving from the industrial miracle to the agricultural crisis. In 1945, the Soviet countryside was an absolute wasteland. Nearly 100,000 collective farms were just gone. We're talking millions upon millions of cattle and sheep lost. The basic ability to even farm the land had been crippled, with a full quarter of their farmland just sitting there, empty and unplowed. In this table right here, it shows a completely different universe from that industrial boom we just saw. Just look at the grain production. In 1946, it completely collapses to less than half of what it was before the war. And even by 1952, 7 years later, it had barely crawled back. The contrast with the skyrocketing output of steel and coal is just, it couldn't be more extreme.
The absolute low point was the famine of 1946-47. Now, a really bad drought kicked things off, but it was state policy that turned a crisis into an absolute catastrophe. The government demanded up to 70% of that tiny harvest to feed the cities and the army. And in doing so, they left the very people who grew the food with nothing. Famine returned to Ukraine, the supposed breadbasket of the entire Soviet Union.
So why? Why the huge difference? Why was industry this roaring success while agriculture was such a spectacular failure? Well, the answer isn't just that they ignored it. It was a series of deliberate and deeply, deeply flawed policies. And one of the most bizarre reasons was something called lysenkosium. This guy, Trofim Lysenko, was a biologist whose theories basically threw modern genetics out the window. Stalin loved him, probably because his ideas sounded like quick fixes. The result? This complete pseudoscience was forced on the entire country, wrecking crop yields and setting real Soviet science back for decades.
And you don't have to just take my word for how bad things were. Listen to this. This quote is from a letter written by farm managers in 1948. These are loyal state employees, and they're explaining with terrifying honesty that the grain quotas were so impossibly high, they were being forced to give away the very seeds they needed to plant for the next year. The system was literally eating itself.
I mean, it was like a perfect recipe for failure. First, the state set prices for grain so low that farms actually lost money growing it. Then, they piled on new taxes. They refused to give villages electricity or even basic materials for rebuilding. And to top it all off, in 1948, they made it illegal for peasants to sell any little bit of surplus food they might have grown. It was a system built only to take, not to grow.
So, this brings us to the really crucial point. How do we even make sense of a recovery that has two such completely different, clashing realities? The answer is in this huge gap between the official story the state was telling and what millions of people were actually living through.
I mean, just look at this comparison. It says it all. On one side, you've got Stalin in public, making these bold promises of strength and a golden future. And on the other, you have that private, desperate letter from the farm managers talking about how the system is consuming its future. This is why comparing sources is so critical. One is the propaganda, the other is the devastating truth.
And there was another huge factor twist in the economy. The Cold War was heating up. You can see right here how military spending just explodes, jumping to a full quarter of the entire state budget in only 2 years. And every single ruble spent on a tank was a ruble that wasn't being spent on a house or on food or on rebuilding a village.
So how do we wrap all this up? Well, the historian Robert Service puts it just about perfectly. He says, the command economy's post-war achievements were real, but came at a huge human cost. And that's it, right there. The Soviet Union did rise from the ashes. That success was real. But that success was paid for by the suffering and neglect of tens of millions of its own people. And that leaves us with a really tough and honestly timeless question. This tale of two recoveries forces you to ask, what price is okay to pay for national greatness? And when does the cost of progress, measured in human lives, just become too high? It's something to think about. Thanks for watching.